nation. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to have our fantastic panelists with us tonight, and we'll be tackling quite a question, which is about arts and heritage and how the sector can deepen engagement with the climate emergency. And we've got three fantastic panelists with us this evening who work across and between culture and climate. And so they're perfectly poised to help us to dig into this topic tonight. So let's meet our panelists. Good evening, panelists. Hello and welcome. I'm going to turn to our provocation in a moment, but first, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. And because you all have such interesting stories of your own, I wonder if you might just say a bit about your own personal or professional journeys towards working within the confluence of culture and climate. And Bridget, I'm going to start with you. Good evening.
Hello, diving straight in. So thank you. So I really can't remember a time when I wasn't ecologically conscious growing up with green parents. I also can't remember a time when I wasn't creative, but those two things, you know, the arts and creativity and ecological awareness ran side by side. And I was always quite frustrated, you know, that I couldn't really find the work, you know, in the confluence of the two. So I really had to make it myself. My background is in museum and gallery education, but I became freelance and set up my own company in 2006. That's Flow Associates. And then over time, really mainly from around 2009, I became more involved. And then it stepped up again in around 2019 when I decided to really move entirely into the area of sustainable ecological culture. And I co-founded Culture Declares Emergency and Climate Museum UK that I'll talk about later.
Thank you, Bridget. Great to have you here tonight. Suba, can I turn to you, please?
Of course. Hi, nice to see everybody. So my name is Subathra Subramaniam. I'm Artistic Director of Akademi, which is a South Asian dance organisation based in London. I've sort of moved countries so many times, usually, mainly between Malaysia and the UK twice. And I think through all of that, my perception around climate is very different, has been so different and so varied. You know, growing up in Malaysia, nobody threw anything away. Nobody thought about waste and things very differently. Culturally, we thought about things very differently. I came to the UK, it was different. I went back to the UK, I went back to Malaysia, things had changed. So I think there's been an awareness around my life and climate in some way, because partly of changing countries and being an immigrant myself. So, and then I went through the normal education sort of route and did a degree in biochemistry and then became a science teacher. And I suppose as a science teacher, it's something that I've taught for 20 years, you know, climate, the way our world works around us, our bodies. And I've taught that for over 20 years. So it's always been a part of my life. And I've also been a dancer since I was, I don't know, tiny. So those two have kind of been there, but they only really came together properly when I worked with David at Cape Farewell in 2003. And then there was an actual physical coming together of the two. And since then, I haven't looked back. So it's just a lot of my work, a lot of my practice, and a lot of what I do now with Akademi still has that whole world of the arts and science coming together.
Wonderful, thank you. So interesting, and the perfect segue to introduce David. David, good evening.
Yeah, it was a lovely introduction, Suba. And exciting times a long time ago. Yeah, you're going back 20 years. I started a foundation called Cape Farewell. I'd been working with some climate scientists back in the day, 20 years ago. And at that point, not many people were even discussing climate change. And there was this kind of wall of acceptance that it was serious. And the scientists were very frustrated and sort of going, well, why is nobody listening to us? You know, they had a very proven and powerful message, but it wasn't getting across. So I thought, well, okay, why not bridge the gap and try and get some of Marta's friends and acquaintances and people I knew And we went up to the Arctic, high Arctic. Suba was with us, which was very exciting, on a beautiful old 100-year-old schooner. So we were sailing the boat, but on board were some extraordinary artists and some extraordinary scientists. And we learned how to craft stories. We found a way of telling the climate importance of its narrative, but also how it is urgent. And we crafted stories. And, we've worked with since then, with over 350 artists, many scientists. We've made films for the BBC and Sundance, and Ian McEwan wrote Solar and lots of other very good outcomes. So it's been a very interesting, perfect journey. It has evolved over the 20 years and it continues. And obviously I'll talk about it a little.
Yes, and thank you, David. I'm going to invite you to talk about it now, because already you're touching on our provocation for this evening, which is, can arts and heritage enhance deeper engagement with the climate emergency? And I think by what you've said already, you might say yes to that question. But just to get us into it, David, in the introduction to your book Unfold, which I've been enjoying very much, you talk about society viewing climate change from the perspective of looking down the wrong end of a telescope. And you go on to say that what artists do is to help shift this from a state of observation to habitation. So is this the place where the arts in particular can enhance engagement with the climate emergency? And I invite you to share your presentation.
Quick answer to that one, Christine, because obviously I thought about it. Yeah, we have, but thankfully we've turned the telescope round and we've realized that climate change is not some faraway issue. It's actually on our doorstep. And I'm going to show you some places in the world where it's really on your doorstep and people are really suffering. Thankfully, we live in a climate which is managing to absorb a lot of the major issues of climate change, but they're still there. And we really have to step up with the rest of the people on the planet. But let me go through and
please, yes,
show you some things. Hold on, I'm getting there, I promise. Okay, hopefully that works all right. So this is the front page of our website, which I all encourage you to visit. But right at the top, it says climate is culture. And when we were up in the Arctic, you're witnessing the demise of glaciers, the extraordinary events that are happening in, really physical time up there. But we suddenly realized, you're sitting up in the Arctic and pretty much all of the world's population is south of you. And you realize actually the causes of climate change are us. The glaciers melting didn't cause climate change. That actually what has happened over the last 200 years, we've involved a quite complex or very complex as global society. And one of the byproducts of that, by burning all the fossil fuels, is we're causing climate change. And that's a very, very serious event that's ramping up. And all of the things the scientists were predicting way ago are now coming to fruition. Yeah, we've got to take it very seriously. So I'm going to whiz through some of the slides. One of the things I also, back to your telescope, what artists do is to take these great big global scientific concepts and make them human scale. They kind of go, this is me, I witnessed this is my involvement. And I think that's a really kind of a powerful message from the artistic community and why it works in crafting the stories. I'm going to whistle through a couple of examples and also to show you how powerful artists and the artist's story can be. This is an artwork by Michael Pinsky. It's on air pollution. That was his topic. And each of those 5 geodesic domes contains the air of one of our polluted cities. We made that sculpture. We put it on, actually, the building in the background is the UN. And it was their big climate emergency conference. So pretty much everybody in that building at some point passed through these geodesic domes, including Greta, came to visit while she was there. also at this moment standing in the dome of New Delhi. And we actually made the air exactly like New Delhi, and people didn't believe it. It was disgusting. It was hot, and you kind of go, and everybody would pass by in 10 seconds and go, I can't cope with that, I can't cope with that. But then we would show them live data from New Delhi, and exactly the same air was actually registering as we had it in our pod, in our dome. And you suddenly realize, gosh, people have got to sleep, eat, just live in that kind of atmosphere for weeks at a time. And it really does cause an awful lot of damage. So the visceral experience of the artwork really resonated and came home. The other thing we did, the woman being interviewed there is one hero of mine, is Cristina Figueres, and she organized the COP21 Paris conference. And did a phenomenal job working years and years around the globe and actually getting a good result. But it just sort of points out that, you know, in these conferences, the media love to have an artwork in the background. So it's a very useful place to kind of do interviews, and it was used a lot, that artwork particularly, and again in Spain. So, you know, although we have the message, it does reach out and is talked about, and, you know, in news items and everything. So again, the power of art. This is Kathy Jetnal-Kitchener. She's a young Marshallese poet. And as you can see, she's in the UN, but she actually read out a poem that she had written to her very young daughter about the Marshall Islands and the plight that they're facing, and presented it to the whole of the UN Council. So again, a very interesting way of getting a message across. It was a beautiful experience. She got a standing ovation, and it's somebody we are working with right now. But you kind of go, where the Marshall Islands? Are they a problem? Well, you can see, I'm standing on one of the islands, but you can see in the distance, a little out from the atoll, another couple of islands. Their average height above sea level is 6 feet. So, you know, as the water rises, sea height rises, their whole 3,000-year-old culture is deeply threatened. So again, telling that story is very, very important. Kathy has now become an ambassador for her country to the UN and to the COP meetings, and is an extraordinary voice. But she's linked to 55 countries around the world identified by the UN who are really suffering the effects of climate change right now. Seriously, and amount of people, refugees, people really suffering. So again, a poet linking to a much farther and greater problem. Going back home, which is actually where I'm sitting right now, we have run the River Run project, and that looks at one of our chalk rivers. And I think if you've been following the museums, you've done a great study in chalk and cotylithophores, which actually absorb more carbon dioxide. The oceans, about 70% of the carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans, far and bigger than the Amazon rainforest. Anyway, so we were looking at rivers, chalk rivers, and why they're polluted, and trying to understand what is polluting them. And in the Froome, which is the river we're talking about here, it's one of the biggest salmon runs. So you're talking about salmon, sea fishing, and the artists were engaged. And this is what happens. We tend to bring the artists together, work with the scientists, work with the farmers, work with the data, and then the artists go away and get to making of art. This is one of the exhibitions we had at Poole and Lighthouse. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it just shows you how you start with the scientific idea and then start creating a narrative, and actually how intriguing that narrative is, and involving people to think about the rivers, what's causing the climate change, but in a different framework, not a scientific framework. So again, a very good result. And I started a slide with a cover, which is the Sirens. There are 4 poets and 2 musicians in this lineup. Great, and they have a band called the Sirens. So again, taking the message of climate change, but putting it out through poetry, through performance, it's a very, and with the music, and it's a very wild experience. So very quick, brief run through of what we do, and also the powerful voice that artists can have and the creative sector can have. And just to go back to Christina, and back to the River Run program, we're working with all of the 5 museums over the next 3 years. Each of those museums is on a different chalk river. They all have their own particular story to tell. And over the next 3 years, we are going to unwrap that story, and I'm very excited by it. Back to you, Christina. I try and stop the share. Oh, stop sharing.
Thank you, David. And we're really excited about River Run and bringing the heritage angle into that collaboration as well. So I'm looking forward to that. And really interesting what you were saying just then about artists making things human scale. And Suba, I'm just going to come on to you next, if I may, because you've obviously been with David and Cape Farewell on some of those Arctic expeditions, and I was listening to a talk you gave about those journeys, and you mentioned that one of the things about the way you worked on those expeditions was to achieve a kind of lived-in experience of climate change. And it's interesting that almost in a way the pollution pods was sort of doing that as well. Actually, I just wondered if that lived-in experience is actually a key principle of how you approach your engagement and your work, and how you kind of give that to others, that same experience.
So as I was saying earlier, I was on the very first voyage with David, the Cape Farewell voyage. And when I first went on that, I felt like I wore 3 different hats in some way, as an artist, as a dance artist, but also as a science teacher, because I was teaching full-time in a secondary school at the time, because I'm also a trained science teacher. And I was also there partly working with a film crew to try and present and try to distill the science, look at the art, and make it accessible to young people, because we were creating this curriculum for geography and for science, and it was funded by Nesta at the time. So I kind of had this role, which was a real privilege in some ways, because it brought together all my own practices as an artist, but also as a science teacher, but also as somebody who's looking at it from the outside. So I had to step out of all of that. And we interviewed so many scientists and so many people. I think we could have interviewed polar bears if they could speak. I mean, we literally interviewed what felt like anything that moved. I was up masts. I was up, I don't know, interviewing Polish researchers stuck in some tiny little part of the Arctic who never saw anybody for 6 months. And then we all turned up in a boat and they were quite excited. And it was just the whole experience was very much about actually, what does this feel like to be in this actual climate and in this surrounding and in this setting that is literally endangered in its own way. And that was when Colin Izot, who was a filmmaker, and we talked a lot about what it would be like to bring children and young people to that. And actually, how do we give them this lived-in experience? And if we did, at a really young age, what could we achieve? And actually, that was the kind of thinking around bringing young people. So Colin and I, along with David and the team, we organised 2 youth voyages to the Arctic, to the high Arctic. And one was with 12 young people from 3 different countries. And then the second one was with 26 young people from 7 different countries. And this included young people who had never seen snow before. You know, we had a girl from South India who'd never seen snow. So we were with her when she touched snow in her hands for the first time. And it was trying to give those young people this lived-in experience of being in a space and being in a climate that was very different. So I'm just going to share my screen now, if you can see that. I'm going to start slideshow from the start. So just to give you a sense of some of the things we were doing during some of these youth voyages. So this was an ice sculpture the young people we were with in the first voyage wanted to create. And actually we took on that voyage, on the youth voyages, the scientists and artists. We wanted the young people to see the world through the scientists' eyes, and we wanted them to see the world through the artists' eyes, and how artists interpreted the science they were experiencing. So this was what we called a little Inukshuk. Each one of those little sculptures is an Inukshuk, which is a Canadian sort of ice or sculpture built out of stones that people leave on the land that they go through to say that they've been through that land. And when we explained what an inukshuk was, this is one of the things that a lot of the young people wanted to build on some of those voyages. So what I'm sharing as part of the slides really are some of the artwork from young people and experiences. So the young people we took did real science. So these are three of the young people we took on the very first voyage, actually measuring glacial melt on a glacier in the Arctic in Svalbard. So the data that they collected formed part of the data that scientist published in his paper that year. So actually it's giving the young people the experience of doing the real science, not dumbing it down, not belittling it, not making it simple, but giving them the opportunity to do the real science in order to understand what they were seeing and understanding. And again, this is where the art came in. The young people did not want to draw graphs, they wanted to be the graphs themselves. So this is a graph of some of the everyday data we collected, and somebody climbed up, not a child, an older person. One of the crew actually climbed up on top of the mast and took the photograph for us. But this is young people themselves saying, no, actually, we don't want to draw a graph. We want to make a graph with ourselves. And one of the things that came out was that actually a lot of them said, well, it's in our hands. Like it is quite literally in our hands and metaphorically in our hands what happens to our climate. And it's not about giving the children the sense of this responsibility and the sense of anxiety or climate anxiety, but actually for them to understand. So they decided that they wanted to collect all the seaweed and made this piece of art. This was the second voyage that we were on. Being a dance artist, I took my dance with me everywhere. So I got everywhere we went, we danced. So this was a tiny little salutation to the place that we were in. And it's taken from a South Indian dance form called Bharatanatyam. And all the dancers, all the young people did this. And we did this everywhere we went. Again, because it felt very normal to do this in that space. And it felt that we were honouring the space and the ground and the land and the area around where we were. And another thing that we talked about lived in experience is trying to understand some of the communities that lived in these places. So these young people actually communicated. This was a tiny little village in Greenland, in one of the places that we stopped on the second voyage. And it was all about going to these places and talking to the young people as much as possible and asking them about their lives and understanding this, so that the young people felt empowered with a voice that wasn't just lived in, but actually listening to people who lived in these landscapes, whose lifestyle were changing. You know, they weren't going out in their skiddoos to go hunting in the same way they did anymore, because they didn't understand. The elders didn't understand their landscapes anymore because the climate was changing so quickly. But understanding that from communities that they saw was really important for us. So we really, as much as possible, when we organised this voyage, made sure that young people came into these villages and had conversations. And as a dance artist, I was really inspired to move in that space, for so many different reasons, because of the physicality of being in the cold. I was born in Malaysia in sort of 30 odd degrees. And suddenly when David said, do you want to go to the Arctic? I thought he was having a laugh. And I said, you are kidding. What, really? Seriously? Why minus whatever degrees? And actually it was, I made a dance film about being in this space and how it felt physically, emotionally. And then one of the things I had a sort of privilege of being was an artist in residence at the Environment Institute at UCL. And during that year of being a dance artist and listening to all the work that was going on, the one thing that kept coming up for me constantly was water and our cultural relationship with water, the lack of it, the problems with it, the melting of it, the lack of clean drinking water. And so that whole year, all the work I did with Cape Farewell inspired me to make this piece of work called Elixir, which was about our relationship with water. And that was with my company Sadhana, the company that I had before I came to Akademi. And just to go back, so much of my work has always had the climate, not climate change, but this notion around sustainability, this notion around our relationship with where we are, where we live, what we touch, what we feel, where we live, how that influences how we live our lives. All of that has kind of been quite a big part of my work. And as a science teacher for over 20 years now, I've stopped teaching full time now, but all the way through, what I found myself doing in those lessons was kind of letting the art creep in and having that being part of how I taught about climate and how we respond Because children, after a while, get fed up of looking at graphs, get fed up of me going on about the greenhouse effect. But actually, I found other ways. As difficult as it is within a curriculum that's full already, it was really difficult. But that's one of the things that I felt really strongly about. And 2 years ago, I got this job at Akademi as artistic director. And very quickly, myself and my exec director, we both made a real strong decision that all the work coming up for us as an organization will be around climate and sustainability. So the first piece of work that is currently touring at Polka Theatre in London, just a quick plug, it's on till the 8th of May, is a piece for children aged 7+, and it's about plastics and our world of plastics. And it's been a real revelation doing the research around what kids already know. So actually, it isn't about raising awareness. It is about empowering kids to look at plastics differently. Because if you understand the beauty of it, if you understand how it is ubiquitous in our lives and you can't get away from it, and how important it is, maybe we do something about it. We don't throw it away. So it's not even about awareness. Kids know. Kids are super clued up about plastics. So we've been trying to find interesting ways of how we've got plastic bags, we've got bottles, we've got everything that we find in our everyday lives. So that work is currently touring, and we've also got it's another image from the work, which is very much about not just the doom and gloom. And it was really important to us about, actually, hope is really important. And that was one of the things that was really, really important when we were making this work, that hope featured heavily. And the piece is a hopeful piece, even though it talks about the doom and gloom of plastics and all the beauty of it and how much it's around us. It was really important to us that we didn't just stick to the sort of doom and gloom. And the work after that for Akademi will be around climate migration, focusing on the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove, and how people are having to move because their landscape is quite literally shifting and changing around them. So I think I feel quite fortunate in so many ways that I can bring the science and the art together. And I have, working with Akademi, I have the opportunity to make all of this work. And also we're really keen as an organisation to support sustainable work. So for the outdoor work, Provas, which is the climate migration work, we're actually going to do an audit around creating work sustainably, not just making work about climate and sustainability, but actually creating work sustainably and how we can share that practice to the industry as well.
Wow. Thank you so much, Suba. That was so interesting. And I saw David smiling along to the Arctic photos, perhaps some memories brought back there. So many things I want to dig into from that presentation in a moment, Suba. But I just want to give Bridget an opportunity to come in now, really, from a slightly different angle, because Bridget, like me, you're coming from a museum's sort of background and sector. And certainly museums largely tend to look through the lens of the past to tell something about ourselves and our place in the world and where we live. But is that the only role for museums and heritage in terms of enhancing engagement with the climate emergency?
No, it's not. So I'll share my screen straight away so I can dive in. So yes, I'm going to talk to you very quickly about museums in the Earth crisis. So I tend to use this term Earth crisis more than climate because it's bigger. It includes what I call the biosphere crisis or trauma. So this diagram, it's really trying to show that relationship between the kind of historical exploitation of the biosphere that has led to, a whole range of ecological problems or breached planetary boundaries. And climate change is one of those that is accelerating, and really, climate is something that is going to be kind of coming in and overlaying on top of that biosphere trauma into the future. But also this diagram really shows that we have to think about about the human experience at the center of it, because we are human, and humans can also, we are the agents that can make change. And just to credit this idea of the trauma sphere to Gia Woodbury, who's an eco-psychologist. So a lot of my thinking and work is really informed by eco-psychology, and the work we do in Climate Museum UK is very much focusing on the social and emotional aspects, engaging people with the issues. So so Climate Museum UK is one hat, but I'll just explain also about other organisations I'm involved with. So I co-founded Culture Declares a Climate and Ecological Emergency in early 2019. We're a growing movement of people, of individuals and organisations in the wider cultural sector. So we don't really put limits on what that means. We invite people to sign up, and it really is a community. It's not just about making a pledge or a statement. It's about forming hubs and groups and doing actions together that are place-based. I should say there's actually no lower age limit on it. So, we do invite younger people, younger practitioners to join. And the other organisation I'm involved with as an advisor, a kind of trustee, is Culture Unstained. And they're one of the organisations in the movement to end fossil fuel sponsorship of culture. So we're a kind of research, engagement, coordinating organisation, really. And you can see from this image, which is the front page of their website, there have been a large number of wins lately, but the British Museum, the Science Museum are holding out. But we hope not for long. So Climate Museum UK, I founded this also at the same time as Culture Declares Emergency. So I had a very, very busy year in 2019. We are a distributed museum, so we don't have a base, no hub. We are working across the UK as practitioners working with our communities locally. So we organise activations. We don't organise exhibitions. We're not curating art exhibitions, for example, but we are all collecting or developing activities, ideas, collections, which we use to activate people. So, but I do want to stress that we're very careful. We share our practice together, and we're very conscious together that we mustn't rush people to action, that it's really important to help people express themselves, be playful, make things, talk, and to open their imaginations to possible futures before or as part of taking action. So activations, the activations that we do often use objects. They get people talking around stimulus materials. On the left, for example, we went to a festival and created a wild museum with the help of the children. And we were dressed as animal curators. So we were trying to get we didn't really have to work very hard, but we got the children thinking from the perspective of animals. I'm going to move on. So yes, shifting your perception, thinking from other points of view is really important. And we're inspired by Renee Lertzman's golden trine of behavior change. This is her thinking about how people respond to their conflicting desires. People want to feel good, but when they see the world in trouble, there's a dissonance. And these are the three responses: denial, disavowal, and rationalizing. Rationalizing is the most common when people are more climate aware and conscious. People jump to action, they're hopeful, they think that a particular solution will save us. But museums, this is to answer your question, really, that museums have a role across time, past, present, and future, responding to those three responses. So in response, they can look to the past and help people discover the truths and the histories of this trauma that we've come into through this history of biocolonialism, exploitation of people's bodies and their lands. so we can support reparation in a broad sense. So we can help people with the present, you know, when people come into cultural spaces, how do we design those spaces so that they're more supportive of people's emotional responses and their relationships with each other as they live with the unfolding impacts. And then we can help people look to the future to explore solutions and grow their appetite for systemic change. So just to finish off quickly, this is a model that I've developed that we use in our professional development work in Climate Museum UK called Culture Takes Action. It's a framework that you can download as a resource to help you plan. And the idea is that there are 8 pathways. It broadens out the notion of what culture can do. And it also asks, what if we put culture in the donut, which is Kate Raworth's economic model for how we can create a safe and just space for humanity within the breached boundaries of the planet. So the donut is that ring, it's like a life belt, really. So, you know, I'm really proposing that we need to go beyond just decarbonising, reducing the harm of our operations, but you know, looking to decolonise, you know, provide cultural therapy and so on. And I'm really keen to see museums being part of the broader movement of regenerative culture. There's a recent blog post I've written called The Regenerative Flip, and you'll find this diagram amongst others to hopefully give you some inspiration for that. And just to finish, culture needs to pivot to planetary first aid in the context of our trauma sphere. And we have to see our audiences as inhabitants, just as we need to kind of inhabit, you know, these complex and distant ideas. We have to see our audiences as inhabitants of troubled ecosystems. And let's keep creating a global community in arts and culture that is more trauma sensitive, more conversational, more future facing, and activating change. So, yes, that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you all of you. So much interesting stuff there and so much overlap. So let me pick out some of the things that I was hearing across all 3 presentations that I'd like to just get into a bit more if we can. I mean, you've all talked about science and engagement with science, and also the kind of human experience of climate and the fear that can bring in. So is engagement with science part of the problem here? And I think back to the pandemic as well, and a kind of societal sense of people not believing science almost. And I'm just wondering where science fits in this debate. And you've all, well, Suba, you are a science teacher, you are a scientist. David, you've collaborated with scientists, and Bridget as well. Any thoughts on how science fits into this in terms of the climate debate and the fear it brings in? Anyone want to take that? Suba, maybe.
I think it gets to a point where it's how much science we have thrown at us, and it's how accessible that is, and how much we are engaging with the language, with the data, and actually it's quite difficult if it's there all the time. And actually unpicking that can be quite difficult. The language can be inaccessible. The data, the pictorial representations, I mean, it's getting so much better. Scientists, you know, the scientists that we've worked with at Cape Farewell and scientists that I've worked with, you know, a lot recently too, are all very articulate about their work and work very hard at making it accessible, but that isn't always the case. So there is some work still to be done in that, bridging that gap between the data, the science, and the communication of it. And it isn't always easy.
Okay, David, do you have anything to add on that? You talked about artists kind of constructing stories from the science.
Yeah, I'll give you a short story, but don't forget technology is also a science. And if you're really looking, I'm not going to advocate that technology will fix anything. But on this issue, if you just, I get a little story. You've got a lump of coal, a coal mine in the middle of Australia. So you dig it up, you put it on a rail, so you carry it all the way to the port. You stick it on a boat, you ship the boat up to China, you set fire to it and produce energy. Now that is a really, really messy process. Now you could, in Australia, put in a solar park of huge scale, get a DC cable and beam it up all the way to Malaysia, probably up to China, without losing too much of the energy. Now that is cleaner, it's got no carbon footprint. So why not fix that? I mean, you know, the only reason it doesn't happen is the people who own the coal mines and the railroads and the shipping and the whatever are pushing back because they don't want to lose their profit. But actually there is a technological fix. Right now, in the box, we can wheel it out. So I think there are so many things that are hopeful that are sitting there waiting for serious money to throw at them in order to deliver the change we need. Now, technology is just one thing, but there's, you know, there are a lot of good technological fixes to this. So that is part of a science. There are so many scientists working on this issue, trying to find the solutions that we need to build a society that doesn't have a carbon footprint and then also doesn't destroy our ecology, which is back to farming. I mean, I'm sitting in the middle of a farm, 7 farms here around me have all gone organic. That is a simple farmer changing his science practice about not putting fertilizer on the land and finding a different solution. That's science as well. Hugely optimistic. So yeah, push back against the doomsayers.
So Bridget, you've come off mute, so please join in.
I just want to make a quick point because there's maybe other questions to remind ourselves that science is obscured, you know, neglected, misunderstood, and you know, perverted by the media that is, or you know, media and other kind of voices that are influenced by the fossil fuel industry. So you know, there's this kind of triage or triangle of our response often being about denial and not wanting to face the truth or to really look at the science, the misinformation, and then science itself often being quite siloized and not always strongly relevant or overtly relevant to people's emotions and needs. Even though it is, of course, relevant, it doesn't come across as so.
Really good point. And I mean, it was good to hear in your presentations words like hope and empowerment and some positive dialogue coming out of this, because so often it isn't a positive dialogue. And you know, something that we've certainly seen through the work on our recent project, and I'd like to hear your experience of, is eco-anxiety, and particularly among young people. I mean, this is a thing now. So how can we support the people we're working with on issues around the climate emergency with eco-anxiety that they might be experiencing? And Suba, I might just ask you that to start off, based on your experience of working with those young people in the Arctic in particular.
Yeah, I mean, also just in terms of current relevance, I've been doing I did before this project, I did a project around mental health and young people, particularly child and adolescent mental health, and working with a psychiatrist. And, you know, he, in one of our Q&As after the show, he talked a lot about the young people that he's seeing now and how climate anxiety is actually a real issue and a real issue. And it does sit, but it sits in a really deep, affected way amongst young people. You know, it's not superficial. It is actually really deep, and it affects our day-to-day lives. And so it is a real thing. And, you know, the work that we've just made at the moment about plastic, some of those kids come away and they sit there and go, well, you know, what can we do? And we talk a lot about, you know, they know what to do, but it's this notion around, for young people as well, it's around responsibility. At what point does that stop? what point does that start? You know, we talk a lot about the fact that you chuck a plastic bottle into a recycling bin and you forget about it. You then take away and remove from yourself all that responsibility because, you know, you put it in the bin. But there is a lot more that happens after that. And I've been talking to a material scientist when we were making this plastics project. He says his biggest thing is don't put it in the bin in the first place. Now, that takes a certain sense of understanding and responsibility amongst young people who are watching these things, who are trying to understand, who are trying to do the right thing. But actually, there's a lot of work that needs to go alongside all of that to reduce the anxiety and to educate and to let people know what they can and can't do. And that, you know, the work has started, but I feel like there's a lot of it out there. And, you know, and it's a lot of it about not even recycling, but reusing, refusing. And we use the word refusing a lot too about plastics. So yeah, I think there's work is there, but that anxiety is real.
And that you're refusing is Bridget in the chat just saying don't buy it in the first place. So absolutely refusing. It actually there's a question from the audience tonight, and which leads us nicely on here, which is, how can I speak to my children about the climate crisis without scaring them? They are at primary school. Anyone want to take that one? Suba. I'm picking on you.
That's fine. I think it's about giving them knowledge and an understanding of what's happening. I feel like knowledge is really important. Knowledge without scaring is really important. And actually, all the things that David, you've just been talking about, the idea of hope and technology and the things that are out there and that are already being done. You know, Bridget, the things you're talking about, you know, in terms of the work that's being done in museums, the work that's being done with young people, it's that feeling of giving them empowering is great, but empowering can also be scary. You know, giving young people responsibility and putting that pressure on them is also scary. So it's about taking that away, but giving them knowledge and giving them all the kind of things that are happening around them and saying, well, look, actually, people are working on X, people are working on Y, people are working on, you know, there are solar panels, there's all of this, there's so much hope, there's so much research, and getting young people to be excited about the science so that they go and do it themselves. You know, I used to run a science club at my son's primary school, and you called them all my budding scientists because that's what they were. They were my budding scientists. They were the ones who were going to go and, you know, help find some of these solutions by doing degrees that they may not think they could. But it's that kind of knowledge and education and understanding and giving hope through what's already happening is a really good way in, I think, without scaring kids.
Bridget,
I just think that we need to maybe shift the question from how do we talk to how do we talk with. So it is so much more about using a kind of emotional register to have those conversations. And also I think that this is why I introduced the idea of the trauma sphere, that we have to understand how all consuming and complex the Earth crisis is, you know, and therefore we have to redesign everything. We mustn't just sweep it under the carpet or see it as a separate subject. Young people feel really pissed off when it is bracketed out, you know, when it's just seen as a small subject or something just relegated to protest or, you know, recycling bins. It is everything. So it's not really so much about a particular topic that we might talk about with children or to children. It's, you know, how do we rethink everything and involve our children in that process of creating a more regenerative culture.
Thank you, Bridget. I want to talk about the conversation around the climate emergency, because you all have been doing this work for quite a long time. And, you know, David, 20 years ago in the Arctic, right? I just wonder how the conversation about climate has changed in your experience in the culture sector in that time. And David, I'll kick off with you on that one.
Well, at least we're having it, so that's a good. No, I mean, actually, it is funny looking at the length of time. When 20 years ago, it really wasn't it was on very few people's lips. You know, we just didn't think about it. We didn't think about the ecology of the planet. So if you actually look back and you go, well, oh, wait a minute, that's 20 years. See how much progress we've made. And then you run the clock forward another 20 years and you think about what's possible to make. So it actually is quite an optimistic journey, mainly because people have engaged with the subject. And again, I think the biggest is just to, I was interested in what you were saying, Bridget, about talking with. I mean, you know, you're a parent, you've lived with this drama for a long time. You've accepted the baggage of the fossil fuel industry, that this is all a negative journey, when actually it's not. It's a very positive journey. And then if you went to the kids and asked them, are they traumatized, or actually are they optimistic about going, oh, we should think about doing this, we should think about doing that, and the kind of messages they're getting from school. So maybe it's us who are making the negative statements because we've got all the baggage that's been put on us. But actually the kids are maybe more optimistic, more exciting. It's their future to build. So maybe that, and also we are on that journey, and it's a good journey. It's an exciting journey. It's full of trauma, but we are potentially on that journey.
I'm sure we're probably running out of time. That's such a great provocation. I'd love to have half an hour's more conversation about it. But I want to, I suppose, when we talk about trauma, it isn't just individual people experiencing trauma. It's that it's an anticipatory trauma and a diffused trauma. And it isn't something that punctures children's lives constantly. You know, children are incredibly resilient and have great reserves of energy. So yeah, I take your point.
Thank you. I've had, I don't know if you spotted it, but a question's just come in from our resident scientist, Anjana Katwa, about how can we help scientists to see the value of artistic approaches in communicating their work to the public? Do you think there is a gatekeeping of knowledge? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Just quickly, that's been one of the most exciting parts of my journey, is that when we started off, the scientists thought that the artists would illustrate their problems, their concerns. And they only had to spend probably half a day with the artists, and they went, oh boy, these guys are far beyond illustrating things. They take it as completely absorb the information of the science and regurgitate it in a completely different way than the scientists could imagine. And they went, oh, I get it, I see that. So it's been a lovely, fruitful conversation between the science and the arts, and we've both surprised each other about what's possible. So very short one, and the number of times that's happened with scientists, I think, has been really exciting.
Brilliant. Suba, please.
I was going to say that it's really wonderful when scientists talk about what they get from the artists, because you don't hear that conversation all the time, but actually that's when it's really exciting, because science is a creative process. You know, scientific experiments are a creative process, and actually the way in which the lens with which artists see what scientists do, when it actually then makes or gives the opportunity for the scientists to look at what they do slightly differently, that's when it gets super exciting. And that's when I get really excited as an artist, because sometimes it's very easy for us to just take as artists. We take the knowledge, we make the work. But actually, there's even more exciting when that knowledge transfer actually happens and something else happens with the way in which scientists think.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to squeeze one more question in, actually, because it is getting close to 7 here, but I'm going to try and get one more in. And you know, you've all touched on you know, the kind of moving from a point of raising awareness and moving beyond that to something a bit more active and empowering. And you know, I think we are moving beyond just the raising awareness in the sector, for sure. So my question is, if we're encouraging people towards activism, if you like, then do we accept that actually could lead on to protest and extremism? Is this something we should be concerned about or something we should support? And I'm going to ask Bridget to respond to that first of all.
I wouldn't want to conflate protest and extremism. protest is an essential part of being an active citizen, and there are so many possible ways to do it. When in extreme circumstances, extreme actions might be necessary. And for example, the self-immolation of an activist that in the last day or two. I do believe that we have to, again, take this broad view of the Earth crisis and understand how it affects people in a multidimensional way, and understand the politics of it, the structural constraints and pressures that we're under, and as much as we can enable people to create thriving lives for themselves. And that does include resisting those oppressive and extractive structures. So I absolutely support activists who are non-violent activists, and I do believe that cultural institutions have a responsibility to support those people, because they might not necessarily be activists all the time. They are living their lives in a whole range of ways, including protest.
Thank you, Bridget. David or Suba, any comments on protest?
I have a quick one. I mean, in a way, one sense is all of the art that me and all of the other artists engage on is activism. We are setting about to try and change society. So that is an active process. I think one of the things that we should not do is either or. It's actually, we're all going in the same direction. The stream is quite wide. I mean, one of the things that art does, a really beautiful piece of art in one sense, is seduce. So in a way, seduction is something that people want to be part of rather than protest as such. But I think both have an equal and powerful voice. So I think a lot of what we do is if you can make something that engages people emotionally, like a song or whatever, and actually people take that on board, then that emotional engagement probably can be a very, very powerful tool in changing somebody's behavior. So in a way that it's just broadening the conversation of trying to implement change.
Thank you. That's such a hopeful message. Suba, any final thoughts from you?
That, young people are almost natural activists, because when they feel really strongly about something, they will tell us. They will want their opinion heard. They want to share that, and actually, an encouraging of that, and encouraging that is, for me, as a teacher, as a dance artist, feels like a really important thing. And that actually that can form, as Bridget, you so wonderfully articulated. Activism is just one part of their lives, or their engagement with this subject in the world around them, the reason they are that way is because they feel strongly about it. And that's a wonderful thing, and it's how we encourage that and we nurture that and we channel that, I think is really important.
Thank you. A lovely point to end, although I'd love this conversation to go on. It's been absolutely gripping and fascinating and very thought-provoking. So thank you all very, very much. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you, Bridget, David and Suba. Absolutely brilliant conversation. And thank you to the audience for coming along tonight and being with us and posing your insightful questions. It's been great having you here as well. If you enjoyed tonight, I'd like to invite you to our next talk, which is called Youth Voices for Climate Change, the Role of Museums. It's on the 8th of June at 6:30 p.m. And in some ways, it's actually the perfect follow-up to tonight's talk, because it will be an investigation more deeply into the role of museums specifically in helping young people to engage with climate change. And our speakers include our very own community curator from Poole Museum, Ernie Pelham, as well as a speaker from Kids in Museums, a national organization engaging children and young people in the museum sector, and a young climate activist. So please join us if you can. And just another reminder that if you'd like to see our digital exhibition, on the My World, My Future project, it is available on our website. And a final plug that if you'd like to support Wessex Museums, please go to our website and make a donation. We'd be very grateful for your support. But on behalf of our panelists and on behalf of Wessex Museums, it just leaves me to say thank you all very much for coming tonight and have a great evening. Good night.
I can see the last two attendees are staff.
Yes, I was just about to say that.
Oh, thank you all. That was super.
Yeah, well done. That was really good.
Good.
Yeah, I think we could start all over again right now.
I know. Well, we could, couldn't we? It was